This lion was cared for by this woman for many years. He grew up under her care and they became best friends. But when the woman suddenly had to move, they were unable to see each other for years. But after 8 years, she suddenly came back. What the lion did next was bizarre. Watch closely for his reaction. But before we start, smash the like button and make sure to subscribe if you haven't, and hit that notification bell so that you won't miss any new stories. The past 8 years have been heartbreaking. Every day, the lion searched for Linda, his caregiver. Marvin often sat in a corner waiting for his caregiver, but he couldn't see her for years. It was hard to see the animal suffering like that. Emotional stress is something that can't be taken away so easily, said the shelter owner. 8 years passed and they both had to miss each other. But then Linda returned unexpectedly, and when she was put back in the cage, everyone wondered if Marvin the lion would still recognize her. One wrong move, or the fact that Marvin would no longer recognize Linda, could mean that she would become his dinner. But what Marvin did next shocked everyone. The story of how Linda met her lion friend Marvin was incredible, and that's why his reaction after her 8-year absence is all the more poignant. Previously, Linda had been a traveling guide. She had done these safaris for many years, but none were like this one. The group got into their car and drove past some giraffes first. The guests were very impressed, but the best part was yet to come. Linda knew that the lion's territory was a little further away. And before she could announce it, the first lionesses appeared. They were really beautiful, and some of them even had a little cub. But unfortunately, disaster was in the air. The lionesses were not alone. She heard the lioness's warning roar. Linda shouted to the driver to drive as fast as possible. Her guests looked confused, but Linda knew exactly what was going on. She drove at a fast pace towards the place where the noise had come from. "Poachers!" she said to her fellow passengers, who had no idea where they were going. Unfortunately, when they arrived at the scene, the perpetrators had escaped. But when an area is contaminated by the arrival of poachers, a pride of lions will never return to that place. They simply know it is no longer safe there and will look for another place to live and roam. And in this case, that was a big problem. Linda got out and slowly walked towards the spot. She was about to crouch down in the dirt to examine the tire tracks of the poacher's car when she heard something. She looked around, trying to find the source of the low moaning. And it didn't take long before she realized where it was coming from. Because suddenly, she saw something moving in the bushes nearby. There sat a little lion cub all alone. His mother had run away, and he was left all alone. Linda knew that she would not come back. Without a mother to guide him through the first phases of his life, the cub would certainly not survive on his own. And at that moment, Linda knew what to do. She immediately felt love for the cub and took him in her arms. She took him to Australia, to a wildlife sanctuary. She also quit her job as a tour guide almost immediately after discovering the lion cub. There was something about him that made her never want to be separated from him again. So she traveled with him to Australia and started working at the sanctuary where the little lion cub was taken. The sanctuary was a beautiful and peaceful place. The lions and other animals that lived there were well cared for, and Linda knew it was the perfect place for Marvin to grow up. She had named him Marvin after her grandfather, and from the moment they arrived at the sanctuary, Marvin had captured the hearts of everyone who saw him. He was a playful and curious cub, and Linda became Marvin's main caregiver. She spent most of her days with him and taught him everything he needed to know about life as a lion in the wild. She watched him grow from a small, helpless cub into a strong and powerful young lion before her very eyes. Linda loved Marvin as if he were her own child. As the years went by, Marvin grew bigger and stronger. Eventually, he was moved to a larger enclosure where he could roam freely with other lions. Linda still visited him every day, but her time with him was limited. She had taken on more responsibility at the sanctuary and had to care for other animals as well. Despite the lack of time, Linda made sure she spent as much time with Marvin as possible. They often played together, with Marvin chasing Linda around the enclosure and playfully pouncing on her. Linda loved every minute of it, knowing she was helping to shape Marvin into the magnificent lion he became. But one day, everything changed. Because Linda didn't just take care of Marvin. Her mother had been ill for a long time, and Linda was also her main carer. She did practically everything for the poor woman. At first, she managed to cope, but as her condition worsened, something had to change. Her mother was transferred to a facility on the other side of the continent. Now Linda had to choose. With a heavy heart, she said goodbye to the rescue center, and with an even more heartbreaking goodbye to Marvin. Tears ran down her cheeks, but she knew it was for the best. She had raised him to be a well-behaved lion and hoped that Marvin would find a new friend in one of the other keepers. But she had no idea. Marvin was devastated. He didn't understand why Linda wanted to leave him. He sat in the corner of his enclosure waiting for her to come back, but she just didn't come. The other keepers tried to take care of him, but he wasn't interested in anyone. He yelled at anyone who came near him and refused to eat or play. The shelter staff were concerned about Marvin's mental and physical health. They knew how important Linda was to him, and they were determined to find a way to help him cope with her absence. They tried to get other lionesses for him to play with, but he wasn't interested. They even tried to get other caregivers, but Marvin just ignored them. As the months went by, Marvin's condition continued to deteriorate. He was losing weight, and his fur was becoming duller. They hired new keepers in the hope that they could bring some happiness back to this sad lion. They knew that Marvin could not return to the wild because he was taken when he was too young to learn how to survive. And since Linda wasn't coming back anytime soon, they had to try something. The new caregivers came and tried their best to help Marvin get back to his old self. But Marvin didn't like these caregivers one bit. One after another came, and one after another tried to re-socialize the adult lion, but none of them could do it. As the years went by, they finally decided to just leave Marvin alone. The huge lion was almost never seen in public. He spent most of his time alone in his secluded den, and when the sanctuary staff saw him, he always looked sad. Marvin just looked around, probably looking for any sign of Linda. "It was hard to see," said one of the keepers. When all this was happening, Linda was caring for her mother on the other side of the continent. She knew about the situation with Marvin and the other carers, but she just couldn't leave her mother. But after 8 years, that all changed again. Her mother lived in her new home in Melbourne for 8 years, but her extended time had expired. Linda's mother's body was worn out, and it was time for her to leave this earth. Linda was happy that she could spend every beautiful moment with her mother. "Go now and be at peace," she spoke lovingly to her mother. Her mother smiled as she fell asleep with a contented look on her face. It was a sad moment, but it also meant something else. The end of that chapter in her life meant she had no reason to stay in Melbourne anymore, so she quickly moved back to the city where she used to live. It was an exciting time because it meant she was living near Marvin again, but she also knew that reuniting with her lion son wouldn't be easy. As mentioned, Linda kept in touch with the rescue center, and she knew that Marvin rejected every caregiver who came after her. She also heard that Marvin was isolating himself, becoming skittish and sometimes even a little aggressive towards people. Linda had been gone for over 8 years, and she wasn't sure if her bond with him as a cub would last that long. Linda knew it would be difficult to get back in touch with Marvin, but she was determined to try. She called the rescue center and spoke to the staff, who were very happy to hear from her. They talked about Marvin's condition and warned her that it could be dangerous. But Linda was determined to see her old friend again. But she hadn't expected the reunion to go like this. She arranged to visit the shelter the following week and spent the next few days mentally preparing for the reunion. When Linda arrived at the shelter, she was greeted warmly by the staff and given a tour of the facility. She was surprised at how much the facility had grown and how many new animals there were. But she was there for one reason only: to see Marvin. Linda could see him from far away, sitting on a rock and staring into the distance. He looked majestic and powerful, but also very lonely. "He's been sitting there like that for days," said the park manager. "No one can even get close to him without him growling aggressively," he said. He was afraid that Linda would suffer the same fate, and maybe even worse. Linda took a deep breath and walked toward the enclosure. Marvin didn't seem to notice her at first, but as she got closer, he turned his head and looked straight at her. His eyes narrowed, and Linda wasn't sure he recognized her. She stopped a few feet from the enclosure and spoke to him quietly. "Hey, Marvin," she said, "it's Linda. Do you remember me? Now or never." The staff opened the door, and even Linda had to admit that she was quite nervous at that moment. She hadn't seen her old friend for so long, and after all, he is still a wild animal. She entered the enclosure, and that's when it happened. For a moment, there was no reaction, but that would change very soon. Linda felt a knot in her stomach and thought she might have lost Marvin forever. But then Marvin slowly walked towards her. Was he going to recognize her, or would he be aggressive as the staff had predicted? Everyone held their breath, and the janitor who had let Linda in stood by the door with his key ready in case things got out of hand. Linda entered his house and tried to make direct contact with him. He seemed nervous, which is not usually a good sign with wild animals. He strolled up and down a row of trees, staring intently at her. Suddenly he stopped and turned his body toward Linda. What was he planning? Would he still recognize her, or was he planning an attack? Linda had always been confident when it came to Marvin, but at that moment, she wasn't so sure. Marvin took increasingly faster steps toward his former caregiver, and then he leapt at Linda with his claws outstretched. He threw her to the ground and began to enthusiastically lick his best friend's face. It was clear that Marvin still recognized her and that he was overjoyed to hug Linda again. The two rolled over, and the surrounding carers stood there with tears in their eyes, watching the spectacle. Linda's reaction was just as special. She wrapped her arms around Marvin's waist and licked him back just as vigorously. It was as if Linda had now officially become Marvin's mother. She didn't care about the few dandelion hairs on her tongue. The moment was overwhelming for Linda. She started to cry, and the tears ran down her face as she looked at Marvin. "I missed you so much," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "I'm sorry it took me so long to come back to you." Marvin just stared at her, his gaze unfathomable. But Linda could see the affection in his eyes, and she knew they had found each other again. For the rest of the day, Linda spent time with Marvin. She played with him and even groomed him. She felt a sense of joy and contentment when she was with him, and she knew that from now on she would always be there for him. "I always said that he was like a son to me, and apparently I was like a mother to him," she said, smiling. Over the next few weeks, Linda visited the shelter frequently. She spent hours with Marvin. She told him stories, brushed his fur, and even walked him around the enclosure. It was like seeing a well-trained dog at a dog show, but in this case, it was a 500-pound lion rolling onto its back, the park manager said. Slowly but surely, Marvin's condition improved. He became less aggressive towards the other keepers and even started playing with some of the other lions in the enclosure. But it was clear that his bond with Linda was special. So of course, she took back her old job as a keeper. That way, she would have to spend a moment without her best friend. As time went on, Linda and Marvin became closer than ever. They had been separated for 8 long years, but their bond had held. and Linda knew that they would always be together no matter what. Ultimately, Linda never regretted the years she spent without Marvin. She knew that she had to take care of her mother, and that was the most important thing. But now that Marvin was back in her life, she knew everything had fallen into place. "There are days when I spend more hours in Marvin's cage than in my own home," Linda says, laughing. And at the end of the workday, Linda hugs Marvin one last time before driving home. See you tomorrow, my friend. You'll never be alone again.